Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Andrews presenting this webinar, webinar 8, in this series hosted by Trotman, which is focusing on Gatsby Benchmark 8. This is the last in the present series of 8 webinars that Trotman have been hosting, which are based on the recently published Careers Leader Handbook that I've written jointly with Tristram Hooley. So this one focuses on Gatsby Benchmark 8, which is the one that focuses on personal career guidance, ensuring that all young people have access to personal career guidance. It reflects the statutory duty that schools and colleges were given in 2012 when the connection service was closed down and responsibility for career guidance in England for young people was delegated to individual schools and colleges. And it's been picked up in the benchmarks as Benchmark 8. So yes, as I say, this has been a series of 8 webinars hosted by Trotman, all of which link to the book. The first one was, and the series was on careers leadership, and the next 7 focused on a benchmark, or in one case, 2 benchmarks in turn. And what we've been doing there is mirroring section 2 of the book, which is the longest section of the book. It has 8 chapters, 1 per benchmark. So whilst this has been a series, and I can see there's 26 people signed up for this session today. Some of you may have signed up for previous, attended previous webinars in the series. So it is one of the series, but I am going to deliver it as a standalone because there will be some of the 26 people for whom they just signed in for this particular one. All that means is there might be a little bit at the beginning and a very small bit at the end that you would have heard before, but the substance of the webinar, the main focus and the main meat of it, all about personal guidance, will be new and unique to this particular webinar. I'll probably talk for about 20 minutes and then I'll respond to any questions that you've submitted by typing in on the panel on the side. Don't worry if your question is not answered, if I miss it, or we've run out of time or whatever. The very last slide in this presentation has got my contact details on it, my website and email address. And I'm very happy to respond to questions after this seminar if you submit them to me by email. And a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides will go up on the Trotman's website, so you've got access to the information after the end of this, or if you have to, for any reason, need to leave early, picking up children from school, making a cup of tea, whatever that is. Okay, so as I say, this is focusing on the Careers Leader Handbook, and we have written section 2 based around the benchmarks. The benchmarks, as you know, set out a framework of good practice for a careers program in a school or college. We deal with each of them in turn, but an effective program would cover all 8 benchmarks, and you can't really deal with them one at a time because they do overlap, and activities will link benchmarks, and that's the idea. The total package should be all 8 benchmarks, but it just we had to have a way of organizing the contents of the book, and it's in the logical structure was to go by the benchmarks. So what am I going to cover in this webinar? This is the first bit is the bit that will overlap with previous webinars, just say something briefly about the benchmarks, although my experience is that around the country everybody's heard of them, most people have read them, and a good number of people are using them. So that'll be a fairly short section on the Gatsby benchmarks. We'll then look at what benchmark 8 actually says. That does relate, as I've said already, to the statutory duty on schools. So technically it's a statutory duty on schools. It's not statutory in colleges, but it's a requirement through the funding agreement. So it's just a slightly different process to get to the same end. And then we'll go through some of the main points of in the chapter. We look at the section where we look at defining professional practice in terms of career guidance. We look at models of delivery, and we look at how do you manage this and lead this within a school or college, linking to all the other guidance that goes on that isn't labelled guidance, but is a contributor to guidance, all those tutoring, mentoring, target setting, academic monitoring, progress reviews, all those sorts of activities, all of which are part of the total package of guidance available to young people. So that's what we're going to cover. If I focus first then on Gatsby benchmarks, this is the bit that will be an overlap for people who've attended previously. Most people are probably aware of this now. This particular report was published in 2014. It's given the title Good Career Guidance. I'll come back to that in a minute. It summarizes research, international research into best practice in career guidance. It was led by Professor Sir John Holman, who's a senior advisor on education matters to the Gatsby Charitable Foundation, which is the charitable foundation of Lord Sainsbury, who some of you may know was a science minister in the Lords at one time. Sir John himself is a former head of science, head teacher, ran a STEM centre at University of York, very interested in science education and links to STEM related careers. He got fed up with people saying career guidance in England was poor. He just said, well, if we're going to do anything about it, we need a framework of what it looks like when it's good. So he went to countries where they have a good education system, as identified by PISA results, etc., and B, a good guidance system as recognised by the various reviews that have been undertaken by the OECD over years of practice in different countries. And on the basis of that research came up with these 8 benchmarks of good practice. What I think is particularly attractive about the benchmarks, 2 things. One, it's a framework that comes from outside the careers world. So it isn't just the careers world saying this is good stuff. And if we're going to make this effective for young people in schools and colleges, we've got to secure the interest, active interest of people for whom careers is not their main job, head teachers, principals, governors, etc. So it's good that it's coming from outside the careers world. But the most important thing, I think, is it's in readily accessible language. It's not tied up with jargon. We know what it is. We know what it means. We can get on now and try and make sure that it's implemented into practice. So that's the Gatsby benchmarks. Those are the 8 benchmarks. In chapter 2 of the book, we deal with each one in turn. In a way, benchmark 1 is the overarching benchmark, which says every school or college should have a stable and embedded program of career education and guidance. And then the next 7 benchmarks, 2 to 8, identify the various elements of that. And the one we're going to focus on today is personal guidance. Now, this is the only time in the presentation that I will go backwards. Look at the title of the Gatsby report. It has adopted the international terminology, which is not terminology that this country used. It is referring to good career guidance and using the term career singular, career guidance, as the overarching term for all these elements. That then leads to a particular problem in the UK and in England in particular, because we use the term career guidance or careers guidance for the one-to-one individual or small group work with young people and with adults. So it looks potentially a bit confusing if you talk about career guidance as the overarching term, and then what we're talking about in this particular webinar, if we also call that career guidance. So what Gatsby's way around that was to refer to this as personal guidance. I, as an individual, professional, having worked in this field for many years, still find that not entirely satisfactory because personal guidance could be on anything. I would have preferred the word career to be inserted there, so it's personal career guidance. So career guidance is the overarching term, and then we could use personal career guidance, but it's referred to throughout the benchmarks as just personal guidance. Internationally, they solve this problem by the career guidance is the overarching term, and the one-to-one stuff is not called guidance, it's called career counselling. If you go anywhere in Europe, the States, Australia, look at systems, they refer to the one stuff as career counselling rather than career guidance. But as ever in England, we adopt a compromise that tries to appeal to everybody. You might notice some of that's happening on the political scene at the moment. So that's benchmark 8. What does it say in terms of what's expected of schools and colleges. This is a quote from the statutory guidance for schools and the guidance for colleges. The most recent versions of those are October 2018, where both documents set out in some detail what's expected, and they set out what's expected in each of the benchmarks. Benchmark 8, so, sorry, I can just see a typo on this slide, which I do apologize for. The text is right, it's just the numbers wrong. It says benchmark 7, where it should say benchmark 8, and that's the only error. The text is the exact text that was there. So, in schools, the expectation is, and I don't make apologies, I know it's bad practice, but I think we should in this case just read what it says so we're absolutely clear. Every student should have opportunities for career guidance interviews with a careers advisor who can be internal, i.e. on the payroll of the school, or external, i.e. bought in, provided they are trained to an appropriate level, and that is defined as holding a qualification at level 6 or above in career guidance. So in most cases for careers advisors, to be qualified at that level, they'd have the postgraduate qualification in career guidance, which is a level 7 qualification, or they would have the level 6 competence-based diploma in career guidance and development. And then in colleges, it's just written in FE speak, so refers to learners rather than students. Again, should have opportunities for career guidance interviews with the careers advisor. Again, can be internal, and our experience is most colleges, they are internal because they employ a team of careers advisors, but could be external, bought in and commissioned, and again, trained to that same appropriate level. Where there's a potential challenge in all of this is this, what it says in the right-hand column, which is the criteria by which we assess whether or not that benchmark's been fully met. This has caused a bit of discussion because in schools it says that every pupil should have at least one such interview by the age of 16 and the opportunity for a further interview by the age of 18. And then in colleges, everyone should have it. The challenge is in practice, we know that no funding was devolved to schools and colleges when they were given the job of securing access to career guidance 6 years ago. None of the £200 million that local authorities spent on the Careers Part of Connections was devolved to schools or colleges. So it's quite a challenge to find the funding, either by appointing somebody, part-time or full-time, buying somebody in, and then trying to give every pupil an interview, or every student, every learner an interview. There's also a professional practice issue here about, I fear it might take us back 30 years to the era of blanket interviews where everybody had an interview whether they needed it or not. And indeed, under the regime that was there pre-connections with the privatized career services, the way those career services was funded, their targets were that every year 11 pupil must have an interview and must have an action plan. And we'd got a bit more sophisticated in our practice at that time by saying, actually, not everybody needs it. We need to identify what people's guidance needs are, who needs guidance interviews, and target at those who need it. Yes, there was some use of proxies like free school meals and having a statement of special educational needs, being potentially neat, all of those things. But actually, it was about identifying what is your guidance needs. So you could have somebody who didn't fit any of those priority groups, but you knew through your tutoring mentoring system was a bit confused about the options in front of them, they would be a priority for guidance as well. And I just fear that this criteria might take us back a bit by where we say everybody must have one, because that's going to be challenging in terms of funding and staffing, and is it best practice? Because the statutory duty doesn't say everybody must have an interview. What the statutory duty says for schools is that pupils should be provided with career guidance, but it doesn't say everybody must have an interview by the age of 16. Actually, the law says, the statute says secure access to, so it should be available to them, but it doesn't necessarily everybody must have one. It should be available to everybody, but not everybody has to have it. Key areas are that guidance must be impartial, which is why there was a lot of emphasis at the beginning about independence and being provided by people who are not employed by the school, because there's a fear that if they were employed by the school, they might be only favouring certain options. Personally, I think the real issue is about impartiality, not independence. It's less important about who employs them. It's more important that people are impartial. It's perfectly possible to be an internally employed careers advisor, working to a code of ethics with professional qualification and be impartial, as long as the senior leadership of the school allows you to be impartial. And being external doesn't guarantee impartiality, because there have been a few, fortunately it's only a very few cases, where somebody who is externally commissioned in a school where somebody has not, where the senior management want to promote the sixth form and not promote other options, and where the careers advisor has promoted those options, they've just said, well, we won't buy you in next week. So who employs you is only a very crude proxy for impartiality. The key thing is about, in this area, if we want good practice, and that's what the benchmarks are about, and the book is about how does a careers leader develop an outstanding provision, we need access for pupils to impartial guidance, whether that person's internally or externally employed. And the guidance that's gone out to schools and colleges become increasingly flexible to enable that to happen. And it says very explicitly in the benchmarks, you could be internally or externally employed. It should cover the full range of options, and this is the definition of impartiality. You're working with the best interests of the pupils, not necessarily the interests of the school to recruit, retain, or in a few cases, remove. And similarly, through the funding agreement, rather than a statutory duty, there is an expectation that there is a similar provision to young people in colleges. There is a recognition, of course, that colleges have adult students as well, but this whole career strategy and this whole area just focuses on the support for young people. Right. I'm going to talk briefly about professional practice. There are whole books written on professional practice in guidance. This is what careers advisors, professionally qualified careers advisors, cover in their training. All we can do in the book is give an insight into what's best practice. We are not trying to provide a manual for careers advisors. Other people have done that more successfully than us. What we're trying to do is provide a professional practice handbook for the careers leader, the person in the school or college who's leading the careers program. And it's perhaps important at this stage to emphasize that that person is a different role from being a careers advisor. There is some confusion, not in the careers world, but outside of that, that people sometimes confuse the role of careers leader and careers advisor. Careers advisor is somebody who offers professional career guidance. A careers leader is somebody who leads the whole program, which includes ensuring access to guidance. I'll quickly say it's possible to combine those two jobs in one person, as long as that person, and more importantly, the person who gave them those jobs, understands they've given them two jobs and they need the time and resources to do two jobs. You can combine being careers leader and careers advisor, and we have models of that in schools and colleges, but this is they are separate, complementary professional roles. So we look in the book about, we define it, what is it? We debate the difference between information, advice, and guidance. There have been too many cases in the past where people have used IAG as a single noun. It is three different things. It is information, it is advice, it is guidance, and they are different orders of activity. I want to be a physiotherapist. What do I need to do? I can give you information on what the qualifications are. How do I get into it? I can give you advice on what you ought to be doing in terms of work shadowing and other experiences and research, and to find out about how do I get into this. I'm thinking of physiotherapy, but I'm not sure whether it's the right thing for me. That's guidance when we sit down and say, what do you think it is? What do you think it involves? How are your current exams going? Have you thought about what we would do if that didn't work out? That's when we get into guidance. They are different orders of activity, and we talk about the different terms that are used. And sometimes I have to admit we don't help ourselves that much by moving from guidance to counselling to coaching, and people outside our world want to say, well, what is it you're talking about? And then we can help you implement it. So we talk about what good practice is. We talk about some of the models of practice that people use. We choose two of the more popular ones. Um, Almost anybody who's been involved in guidance training is probably aware of Gerard Eden's book, The Skilled Helper. That's been quite adopted in quite a lot of settings. People use that approach to guidance. So we discussed that in some detail. But then we've taken a more recent theory, a model of guidance from the coaching field, the GROW model, where we talk about that in some detail. This is not the place in the webinar, certainly at 20 past 4, we'll get going into details of these models, but we discuss those in the book to give an insight into what is meant by guidance. We also explain how the profession is organised in the UK. We talk about the single professional body that there is now, the Career Development Institute, which grew out of the merger of 4 previous established professional bodies that work with young people, adults, people in the private sector, etc. We talk about these 2 main qualifications that I've already mentioned, and we give advice to the careers leader about the Register of Career Development Professionals. In the CDI, anybody can be a member, but to be a registered member, there's an additional fee, but to be on the register of career development professionals, then you have to hold a level 6 or above qualification in career guidance. But this is a way of careers leaders trying to find a careers advisor who's available, who could work in their school or college, because they could choose. That register has probably got about 1,000 members on it. So you can search for what career advisors are available in my area. In terms of models of delivery, I've said that the benchmarks permit, certainly the DFE guidance also permits internal models and external. Where we see internal models in a school and in colleges, people employed professionally qualified careers advisors. Colleges have done this for years. A few schools have done it for some time, and certainly in the last 6 years, since a number of very competent careers advisors unfortunately lost their job because of the closure of connections and were on the labour market, some schools and colleges have appointed those people. Another way of achieving the same end is to take a member of staff, could be a teacher, could be a member of the non-teaching staff, and enable them to complete the level 6 diploma in career guidance, and they become the careers advisor internally. And that's the model that almost all colleges use, one of those 2. Schools, some of them have internally appointed people, others commission from an external source, and these are the places that they buy it from. Some local authorities have continued to offer a service on a trading basis. Some of the careers companies have continued to trade and offer services. Probably the most common approach that we see is the sole trader, careers advisor. But some of those careers advisors have formed social enterprises, and there are new organisations formed by several careers advisors working together who offer services to schools. And schools are not just adopting one model for the last 6 years. They've set something up and then kept it under review and maybe moved to a different model if they find something works differently. And one of the questions that schools are thinking about now is, do we do this as an individual school, or now we're all encouraged to be part of a multi-academy trust? Not all of us, but several of us are. Would it make sense to do this as a group of schools, economies of scale? We could have a careers advisor that we can move across from one school to another to meet peaks and troughs in demand, cover sickness leave, those sorts of things. So would we be better doing it as a trust rather than just as individual schools? And then the last area I was going to talk about was this whole links with tutoring and guidance. I think there's been a real heavy investment in schools and colleges of staff time invested in talking to young people on a one-to-one basis, far more than there ever was in the past. And very few of those tutoring, progress reviews, mentoring discussions stop with how's it currently going. They all get into what next. Your best intelligence as a careers leader for finding out which students need access to guidance is to talk to your tutors and mentors who talk to those young people all the time. So the role of the tutor and mentor is to provide some initial, perhaps information and advice rather than guidance, but certainly then to diagnose who needs guidance and have a referral system where they can refer them on through the careers leader to the careers advisor. And then the circle is completed by when the student has had a guidance interview. There's a role for the tutor to follow that up and say, okay, you've had some guidance now. What happened? What did you decide? What are you going to do? Have you done it? So we talk in the book about part of the leadership and management role of the careers leader is to work with pastoral managers, tutor managers, to try and get a joined up approach to the whole business of individual one-to-one support, tutoring, mentoring and guidance, having effective recording and referral systems. And within the tools in the associated with the handbook, we offer a pro forma to help people review that. So this whole question of what records do we keep for the students? What records do we keep for ourselves? Do we share any of that with parents? What's our referral mechanisms? And another role for the careers leader is just to keep an eye on who's had an interview. If there's several different people offering guidance interviews, external sources, internal sources, the targeted support that's still available from the local authority for young people who are deemed vulnerable or disadvantaged. Have we got a handle on who's had an interview and who needs it? We signpost people to relevant additional resources. All we can do in the handbook is give an overview, but if you want to explore some of these in more detail, so if you're interested in some of the theory and practice of career counselling, Hazel Reed's book is very good. We talk about the matrix standard, which is the sector standard for any service offering information advice services. And we point people to the Career Development Institute's own publication on a practical guide on how do you go about commissioning career guidance services, because that's relatively new territory for schools to have to buy in. Up until 2012, it just turned up. Connections was there in September. Now there's a process of commissioning guidance. So how do we do that effectively and get the best practice for our students? So that's what the chapter covers. As I say, it all comes from the Careers Leader Handbook. There is on the Trotman's website a separate section on the Careers Leader Handbook, and that's where you will find, if you look at the left-hand column on this slide, the second item down, tools, we have produced, I think it's about a dozen different planning and review documents which are available in PDF and Word formats that you can download and use to support some of the activities that we talk about. And the one that relates to benchmark 8 is there's something there that helps you review how all of these one-to-one conversations inside a school or college with tutors and mentors and careers advisors all fit together into a coherent package of support for young people. And actually those tools are available to anybody, whether they buy the book or not. We just hope that if people discover them without buying the book, that then entices them to think, perhaps I would like the book. So that's the tool that you'll find that relates to this particular chapter. And then just in summary, because this is the point in the webinars, previously I would have talked about what's coming next, but this is the final webinar, so this will be fairly short. That's the book. So if you still haven't bought it and you've got an aunt or uncle who's saying, what do you want for Christmas? Hopefully here's an answer. Here's the link to the section of the website, Trotman's website. It's probably how most of you found out about this webinar. It's gone through there anyway, so you're familiar with it, but a wealth of resources and regular newsletter going up on that website that's available to everybody. Here's just some of the references that we referred to, the big major documents that we refer to throughout the book. There are references throughout the book in the more detailed chapters. So, in summary, what's Benchmark 8 about? It's about the careers leader's responsibility to make sure that your students have access to personal careers guidance interviews, making sure that you comply with what the requirements, decide whether you employ and line manage somebody or commission and project manage an external careers advisor, and how you manage all the records, referrals and monitoring It's that aspect of a careers leader's role. Um, this is the last in the series of webinars, last in the present series. We are talking to Trotman about whether we offer another series, perhaps slightly shorter series, focusing on sections 3 and 4 of the book, which are section 3 focuses on the leadership role and responsibilities, and section 4 focuses on evaluation and development planning and continuing professional development. But for the moment, that's it. I will go and review if there are any questions typed up and answer those, but I'll leave you with that slide, which gives you my email address if you'd like to follow up any of this with a question to me. And I've also put my email address, my website address up there. I do have a section there, which is a latest news section where I try and put headlines of things that are happening in. There's quite a lot happening here in this space at the moment. Right, thank you for listening. I hope you found that helpful. I'm just going to look to see if there's any questions. And then, well, the one question I can see is, do you have any suggestions of how to meet the criteria of every pupil should have an interview by 16 if a school can't afford this? I don't have any quick instant solutions. I did talk about the challenge of the way that the criteria for this benchmark is expressed, saying everybody should have an interview, where actually the statutory requirement says it should be available to everybody. I think all you can do is your best endeavors with the resources that you've got. You explain how you identify who is a priority, and what mechanisms you use, and ensure that those students who don't have an interview with a level 6 qualified careers advisor, that you can demonstrate that you have checked out what their plans are and that they are on track to making an appropriate destination, a sustained destination onto their next stage. You can just have your best endeavors. But until the criteria change, I can't see how there's a quick way of meeting the criteria other than giving everybody an interview, which very few schools and colleges can afford to do for everybody. So I think you just best endeavors and just demonstrate to anybody who asks, be that an Ofsted inspector or anybody else, how do you prioritize those who do get it, and what support, if it's not with the level 6 person, you do offer to the other students. I think that's the only question I can see up here at the moment. So I'm going to sign off now. Thank you for attending. Probably overshot by about 10 minutes, but you've all stayed here. There's 26 still signed in. So thanks for listening. And if it's not too early, have a good Christmas.